acknowledge the indigenous peoples of this land and their long-standing struggle for liberation. I also want to thank my colleagues Michael Peters and Tina Besley for inviting me to be here with you today. I want to thank Nita Freire. I don't know, Nita, are you here? Is Nita here? I don't think that she's here right now, but I want to really thank her for her effort, her tireless efforts to conserve the integrity of Paulo's work. I want to also thank you all for all the folks that have been here, making their experiences, and this experience is for me, a truly critical engagement through your words, your responses, your insights, which echo your commitment and our commitment to liberation. It's always tough to be towards the end of the program because there's so many wonderful things that have been said, and when you know that so many of the points that you're going to make in your prepared address have already been given, perhaps even more eloquently, but nonetheless, I will share my thoughts that are grounded in my lived experiences in the U.S. as a woman of color, as a woman who grew up in poverty and lived in poverty until I was about 26 years old when I finally got out of nursing school, and then kind of onward and forward. And hope that they will, at the very least, reinforce that our struggles for liberation are worthy of our perseverance, discipline, and commitment, and are far more complex and exhausting than we ever believed when we first began our journey. For more than 40 years after Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Press, was first released in English, the inequalities and injustices that he was addressing then continue to persist in the United States and around the world. In many instances, these conditions were worsened in the last 2 decades with the infusion of neoliberal imperatives of privatization, deregulation, and the free market into every aspect of our lives, including education. Thus, it is important to begin discussions about the legacy of Paulo Freire here, since often it has been precisely Freire's critique of capitalism and the link of schooling to class struggle that have been stripped away, resulting in watered-down, diluted versions of his ideas. Moreover, as a scholar of color, a colonized subject, and reared in horrendous poverty in the United States, there's no way that anyone can convince me that the oppression's center of gravity for those of us deemed as other is simply the psychological aberration of white people toward our so-called races. Rather, I argue that the racialization process experienced by the marginalized are intimately connected to the material domination and exploitation of our communities by the wealthy and powerful elite, and enacted for the most part by those who are not themselves of affluence, but answer its siren call daily. With this in mind, I want to share with you some ways in which radical Black, Latino, Native American, Asian Americans, working class communities from the 70s on embraced Freire's treatise. For many of us, Paulo was one of the few philosophical educational theorists at the time who spoke to our grounded understanding of racialized oppression as powerfully linked to imperialism and its consequences. In other words, if we were to counter the impact of historical and contemporary wounds of slavery and colonialism in our lives, we had to begin by engaging the manner in which racism is inextricably linked to the imperatives of social class formation and material exclusion. For activists of color, the struggle was not foremost about celebrating diversity, but rather a struggle for our humanity and our very survival, given that we had suffered in the flesh the violence of oppression at every level of our existence. Hence, the more radical arms of the civil rights era, including the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, the American Indian movement, the Chicano movement, the Asian American movement, and the Third World Women's Alliance, and others recognized that our local political struggles for self-determination had to also be anchored to a larger international class struggle against the ravages of capital. Moreover, movement organizations of color understood our struggle within the context of a long history of oppression. Hence, important links were made between the economic imperatives that led to the colonization of our lands and the enslavement of our Black brothers and sisters. As such, we recognize that the purpose of our engagement of Paulo Freire's work was as much about the political decolonization of our communities as it was the decolonization of our hearts, our bodies, and our minds. In this sense, Freire's recognition that the oppressor dialectic was also internalized among the oppressed echoed the voices of José Martí, Alviso Campos, Angela Davis, Russell Means, Leonard Peltier, Frantz Fanon, Albert Memmi, and W. Du Bois, just to name a few. Many activists, educators, poets, and writers of color of the 20th century spoke to the phenomenon in their political articulations about the struggles of oppressed populations. Writing about our twin beings, our black skin, white mass, our double consciousness, our biculturality, and so on, spoke to the collision of not simply two cultures, but of deep asymmetrical relations of power that led to the subordination and erasure of our cultures, languages, and historical understanding of who we are and how we are located in the context of U.S. hegemony. Restoring the integrity and power of our voices and centering our cultural and historical knowledge of survival became an important political quest in an era where our voices and participation remain relatively absent from the spheres of power and decision-making in the larger society. Yesterday, when Nita, 2 days ago, when she made the comment that she would speak in Portuguese because I have force in my language, really, fuerza is a word for power in Spanish. And so it's even stronger. It's when I speak in my language, I have power. Cuando yo hablo en mi lenguaje, yo tengo poder y yo tengo fuerza de vida. The familiarity of our own language and culture is what allows us greater freedom to struggle. I remember that as a young woman, meeting Paulo Freire truly changed the course of my life as an educator and political activist. This was for many reasons, but perhaps also partly because he looked and felt so familiar to me, like our own people exiled in our lands. And at the time, he was exiled from Brazil for his emancipatory literary let me slow down. His literacy campaign with disenfranchised people in the countryside. Yet he attributed so much of the formulation of pedagogy of the oppressed to what he learned in his relationship with those who were dispossessed. Thus, Paulo inspired in activists and educators of color confidence in our own reading of the world and political clarity and commitment to a struggle that included us, yet also extended beyond ourselves. Freire challenged us to embody our commitment to political consciousness and social transformation within the relationships we forge with those within and outside our own communities. What we understood was that pedagogy of the oppressed was not only for the classroom, but rather a living pedagogy of love that has to be infused into all aspects of our life, including our politics. This is to say that teaching to transgress constituted for us a moral stance, often belittled and diminished in political discourse, so much so that it cost bell hooks to write. It always astounds me when progressive people act as though it is somehow a naive moral position to believe that our lives must be a living example of our politics. For people who had been betrayed by our schooling, Freire offered possibility of an educational project for our children and communities tied to a larger democratic vision, one that resonated with our anti-colonial struggles for self-determination and our desire to control our own destinies. In the early history of the civil rights educational struggles in the United States, educators and activists of color saw multicultural education as a possible counter-hegemonic mechanism for decolonizing the curriculum and transforming classroom life. In the 70s, notions of biculturalism tied to the struggle for bilingualism began to evolve, and efforts were forged towards developing culturally relevant pedagogy. Many of these pedagogical efforts were founded on the principles that Freire first outlined in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Those principles challenged cultural invasion and the banking model of education and called for a problem-posing pedagogy that would support the evolution of critical consciousness in disenfranchised communities and beyond. Freire's notion of cultural invasion was overwhelmingly salient to those of us with histories of genocide, slavery, and colonization. It's always interesting to me when I worked with students in terms of reading Freire, or folks in communities and reading Freire, that those of us who had lived conditions of oppression didn't have a lot of problems understanding Freire's work. It wasn't that we understood every word, but we seemed to understand what Freire was talking about, whereas students who were more affluent struggled and complained about the language and all of this, and it really told you that in his work was a power that challenged ideology. However, as critical multicultural education efforts began to take hold in the late 1970s and 80s, reactionary conservative backlash and liberal rewriting of multiculturalism began to steadily erode the transformative intent of the project. Many of the multicultural education efforts that took hold in schools by the late 80s and 90s not only conserved a racializing hierarchical structure of power, but also intensified the process of hegemonic class formation within communities of color. Anchored in pathologizing and deficit notions, whether those be of nature or nurture, conservative, whitewashed, multicultural education discourses became the order of the day, while discussions about the race problem or the race as a determining factor in the academic achievement of students of color prevailed in educational debates. In true colonizing and hegemonic style, many radical educators, particularly those of color who remained aligned with Freire's pedagogical and political concerns, were pushed out and marginalized as new white liberal multicultural education gurus descended on the stage to dominate and distort revolutionary pedagogical discourses that had originated within the context of decolonizing struggles of oppressed communities. Often well-meaning discourses of urgency justified by cycle of poverty interpretations, which blamed our children, our families, our culture for our own impoverishment, were used as rationales for intervention that served to curtail our self-determination and our opportunities to evolve politically and advance in our process of self-reflection and our practice of decision-making within our own communities. I mean, there's this notion that somehow we just, that if you're evolved, you somehow know how to be a democratic being. And we know that that's bullshit. I mean, sorry. We know that that just is not the case. The reality is that to live as a democratic being requires a process of practice, of trial and error, of struggling with one another, of engaging one another, of fighting with one another, and moving beyond that. And that's what often was taken away from us. It was almost like they gave us some money. If we didn't get it right immediately, like within a short amount of time, then it was, let's take the money away from these people. They just can't even handle it. As a consequence, many of us found our efforts warped into unrecognizable proportions, rationalizing once again the superiority of white multicultural educators who appropriated our decolonizing language and concepts and used them in the construction of models that essentially rendered our communities objects of their interventions. Token educators of color who followed their lead were effectively integrated into schools and teacher preparation programs to marginalize decolonizing discourses and practices of more radical educators of color, a phenomenon whose consequences being dramatically felt today across the entire educational landscape as scholarship tied to cultural and language rights has gone out of vogue and now considered passé in the flat world of neoliberal multiculturalism. In the process, the transformative potential of multicultural curricula, texts, and pedagogy has been all stripped away, while a fragmented and decontextualized curriculum of cultural songs, stories, holidays, and heroes prevail within the same ideological context of white supremacy. With the eclipse of the so-called multicultural age in education, persisting problems and concerns raised by educators of color for almost a century now fall on deaf ears, as the instrumentalizing ideology of neoliberal education has devised limited matrices of accountability that deliberately discount historical and contemporary community concerns related to culture, language, class, pedagogy, power, and knowledge production. Instead, the numbers game of high-stakes testing, the standardization of knowledge, and teaching to the test curriculum dominate mainstream educational interventions for the most disenfranchised. Consequently, we find ourselves today more mired in Western ethnocentric universal notions of humanity than ever, where individualism, object-based, future-focused, and materialism counter the legitimacy of subordinate cultural community values and traditions. Additionally, this leads to the negation of the worldviews of those deemed other, including marginalization of communal strategies, ancestral knowledge, or spiritual traditions that might enhance the teaching and learning not only of our children, but all children. More often than not, well-meaning educators seeking to address the needs of working-class communities of color continue to be entrapped in a deficit paradigm of difference that negates the knowledge and power of our lived histories. Even more disconcerting, when critical educators of color attempt to challenge these deficit notions in our teaching and research at all levels of education, mainstream educators, many who pride themselves of being anti-racist and social justice advocates, greet us with resistance and unparalleled requests for legitimacy of claims that are deeply anchored within our particular cultural paradigms and philosophical assumptions of humanity and community self-determination. These paradigms and assumptions often reside outside many well-intentioned but still colonizing priorities and directives which objectify and render passive students from poor and working-class communities of color. This, of course, echoes modernity's historical project of political and historical colonization, anchored in a conceptual narrative and societal design that legitimates and naturalizes the cultural, economic, and military domination, exploitation, disempowerment, and dispossession of the majority of the world's population in the name of democracy, progress, and profit. There is no question that the dehumanizing currents of the contemporary neoliberal agenda require us to grapple seriously with the struggle for our humanity, as Freire argued, in the face of hegemonic forces that seek to colonize every aspect of our life from birth to death. That is precisely why the emancipation of our humanity must be central to any decolonizing struggle. We must grapple with the historical consequences, then, of power differentials upon our lives. We need only consult history to confirm the politics of colonization has been rooted in violent culture of economic exploitation and racialization, which has provided the hegemonic apparatus to justify imperial expansionism and the unmerciful genocide and or conquest of those deemed somehow less human. Returning to Freire's notion of capitalism as a root of domination, it is useful in this analysis to also link past and present colonizing forces to the subordinating role of populations' perceived capacity for productivity within capitalist society. This is to say that ultimately the worth of an individual or a people has been literally tied to their capacity to contribute to the process of capitalist accumulation. Often that's totally left out of the picture. That this aspiration of students, what is the aspiration for? What is this achievement for? It tends to be very much driven to how those students can enter into the workplace according to a particular agenda that may not even be in their own interests. This is to say then that the ultimate worth of an individual and people is literally tied to their capacity to contribute to capitalist accumulation. Hence, rather than pedagogical concern for our humanity, our sovereignty, or the evolution of critical consciousness in the interests of culturally democratic life, educational objectives within the U.S. emphasize to what extent students have the potential to participate as productive citizens and consumers and stewards of the empire. Moreover, schools as economic engines function effectively in the process of class formation and the production of a national workforce that is in sync with the requirements of the labor market and military demands of a culture of perpetual war. The United States is a culture of perpetual war. And I think that at many times that is one of the hidden pieces, one of the hidden curriculums of U.S. imperialism. It is here where the politics of meritocracy in conjunction with high-stakes testing is effectively normalized and utilized to sort, sift, reward, exclude students accordingly. As would be expected, the children of the affluent just happen to rise to the top, while the majority of poor and working-class students of color populate the rosters of the academically underachieving, where they, their families, culture, their language is held suspect and responsible for these children's failure. All the while, the larger economic inequalities and hegemonic educational forces that negatively impact the lives of working-class students remain veiled in a victim-blaming discourse of accountability, personal choice, and the myth of equality and justice for all. Central to Freire's pedagogical thesis is then an understanding of the significance of cultural context in the process of knowledge production. This is as true to the larger context of class formation as it is to the question of bicultural formation, where students must daily navigate the tensions of the subordinate-dominant divide. Hence, Freire's work has been and continues to be significant to critical educators and activists of color in that it reinforces the political necessity of contextual knowledge, communal and relational knowledge that does not transcend the individual subject, nor the material conditions that shape the histories and everyday lives of formerly colonized and enslaved populations in the United States and around the world. From this standpoint, if we are to genuinely contend with the educational difficulties of students from working class, racialized communities, we must look beyond simply the personal or individual. We must seek answers, as Freire argued, within the historical specificities of economic, social, and political structures of oppression, so that we might better understand the forces that give rise to relationships of inequality and social exclusion as they currently exist within our own lives and the lives of our children. Moreover, this call for the enfleshment of knowledge moves us away from those colonizing abstractions and separations of the body and land that have always worked in the colonizing interests of the powerful and the wealthy. This is to say that the underlying purpose of hegemonic power is to legitimate and conceal imperial colonial relations. As such, the political work of the oppressed has always required the unveiling, the naming, and challenging of asymmetrical relations of power and their consequences within our schools, our communities, and the larger society. It is from this political imperative that philosophical critiques related to objectivity, absolute knowledge, reductionism, ethnocentrism, and elitism, as well as structural critiques of class inequalities, cultural invasion, racism, sexism, heterosexism, and so on, have been waged. For some, this may echo the mantra of intersectionality so often heard in oppositional discourses. However, as Rodolfo Torres and I have argued in After Race, Racism After Multiculturalism, many intersectionality arguments still fail to confront the totalizing impact of capitalism on our lives. That is, racism, sexism, heterosexism, disableism, all forms of oppression are implicated in an interlocking set of relations that preserve and sustain the violence of capital. Beyond the obvious material dispossession of these oppressions, Freire spoke repeatedly about the manner in which conditions of economic exploitation and domination dehumanize us, distorting our capacity to know and to love one another, to love our world, and to love ourselves. In concert with Antonio Gramsci before him, Freire was well aware of how even well-meaning educators, through lack of critical moral leadership, participate in disabling the hearts, minds, and bodies of students, an act that interferes with the development of social agency and the political understanding necessary in order to transform the debilitating social and material circumstances that betray our freedom to be. Freire's notion of embodied love and the dialectics of revolutionary practice has provided many activists and educators from disenfranchised communities a critical political foundation for liberatory struggles and a pedagogy committed to the collective and ongoing struggles for emancipation. Freire insisted, quote, "While both humanization and dehumanization are real alternatives, only the first is our vocation, a vocation that is thwarted by injustice, exploitation, oppression, and the violence perpetrated by oppressors to preserve their dominance over the world, but affirmed by the yearning of the oppressed for freedom and justice." Starting from the realization that we live in an unfree and unequal world, Freire affirmed that our struggle for our humanization had to involve our struggle for the emancipation of labor and for the overcoming of our alienation, so that we might affirm ourselves as full subjects of our lives and of history. However, the pursuit of our full humanity, he argued, could not be carried out in isolation or as individuals, and I would add on the therapy, chair. I say that because sometimes, people come, they psychologize this, and it really pisses me off. But only in the fellowship and solidarity of communities and social movements. violence. Thus, relationships of solidarity built through collective labor remain central to our politics and our pedagogy, given that it is the process of revolution that human beings in communion liberate each other. For Freire, our capacity to be free required a fundamental shift in how educators and students defined our lives and our conditions of labor. This requires the ejection of colonizing conditions of domination, the establishment of solidarity with others, the existence of meaningful choices in our lives, the recognition of ourselves as subjects of history, the courage to speak out when necessary, and a well-developed sense of empowerment and social agency in order that we could name, critique, decolonize, and reinvent our world collectively in the interests of social justice, human rights, and economic democracy. In waging struggles for social change, it has always been imperative with those who have been oppressed to recognize that domination does not exist within a closed world, but a world where there is no exit. That sense of moving against that sense of fatalism and hopelessness. Instead, Paulo reminded us, this struggle is possible only because dehumanization, although a concrete historical fact, is not a given destiny, but the result of an unjust order that engenders violence, which in turn dehumanizes the oppressed. And I would say the oppressor as well. Significant here was Paulo's acknowledgement of the psychological, physical, and spiritual violence that communities of color have endured for centuries at the hands of the colonizer. Moreover, his political and intellectual courage to link the question of violence to intentionality was particularly important to our historical struggle. This is to say that although Freire never condoned violence in any of his speeches or his writings, he clearly recognized that there was a different phenomenon at work in violence that is engendered by those who seek to dominate and exploit, and the violence that is generated as a response of the oppressed who counter the marginalization and dispossession. This fight, because of the purpose given it by the oppressed, he said, will all actually constitute an act of love, opposing the lovelessness which lies at the heart of the oppressor's violence, lovelessness even when clothed in false generosity. And as such, Freire embraced till his death history as possibility. He believed to his core our potential to remake history through our commitment to struggle. For it is precisely because oppression exists as an impermanent, incomplete, and changing historical phenomenon constructed by human beings that we, as empowered, decolonized subjects of history, possess the possibility of transforming its configurations. Our task then as critical educators and anti-colonial subjects committed to a just world is to embrace fully this dialectical understanding of our relationship with the world so that together we might transform our teaching and our learning into revolutionary praxis, a pedagogy of reflection and action, of theory and practice. Paulo knew that this way of life required a critical commitment to move beyond piety and sentimentalism and egotistical, individualistic gestures and self-serving notions so that we might risk an act of love and enter into sustaining and nurturing political relationships of dialogue and solidarity, communal relationships grounded upon our unwavering fidelity to break out of the domesticating and colonizing conditions that trick us into complicity with an economy that is incapable of developing programs according to human needs and that coexists indifferently to the hunger of millions to whom everything is denied. Later, Freire would urge us to construct within schools and communities what he called advanced forms of social organizations capable of surpassing the articulated chaos of corporate interests. This, of course, points to the corporate policies of economic Darwinism that promote deregulation, the free market, nationalism, and militarism through an ethnocentric ethos of survival of the fittest, which shamelessly justifies its perilous impact upon millions of people and the destruction of the earth ecosystem. Freire acknowledged that radical struggles by those who dare to exercise their political will and capacity within schools could be severely curtailed by the tendency to become hardened by the dominant bureaucracy's oppressive expectations and dehumanizing posture to those who critique the system and seek social change. The concern there was always how people who started out with a good political agenda could end up then just compromising themselves because they're trying to stay, keep the job, and so it created all sorts of contradictions. None that I'm sure you have all your stories about those. He recognized that more often than not, the phenomena is prevalent because critical educators, and in particular educators of color, committed to a Freire-inspired pedagogy within schools and communities are perceived by institutional gatekeepers as disruptive, as angry, or obstructive, while our efforts to achieve greater freedom and autonomy are discouraged or punished, even by those who would call themselves our allies. In efforts to control and inanimate teachers and students of color, educational policies often deter the drive to search, that restlessness and creativity that characterizes life. In response, Freire believed that true learning had to aim to critically unveil and unmask the contradictions and to courageously challenge those practices that despirit and objectify us, preventing our political expression as full cultural citizens of our communities, of societies, and of the world. Paulo recognized often and often spoke of the enormity and difficulty of this pedagogical vision that he had posed for us. Nevertheless, he would see no other alternative to the restoration of our humanity than to eradicate the debilitating fatalism and imposing myths that seek to alienate and render us passive, while underhandedly seeking our consensus and participation in our own oppression. Indeed, Freire's anti-colonial vision entails a need for an ongoing political process of personal and communal struggle, which demands our ongoing critical vigilance and our sustained collective labor, a labor born of love, deeply anchored in an unceasing political commitment to know, through both theory and practice, the nature of the beast that preys upon our humanity, and with this knowledge fight with unwavering hope and solidarity. For many of us from poor and working class communities of color, the option of struggle was never a choice, but rather a political necessity. If we were to realize our self-determination and ensure our right to exist in sync with the cultural wisdom forged from our own lived histories, we were going to have to fight. We were going to have to be willing to struggle and to persevere. For anybody who's getting anxious that when I start crying, I may not think. I can do both. I think what's important is to recognize that the work we do is embodied, that it's embodied. And part of that embodiment is that how can we be dispassionate about the suffering of so many people? A key concept for many activists and educators of color has been, as has been for others, has been Freire's revolutionary vision of education. Education, he said, never is, has been, or will be a neutral enterprise. He wrote, it does not matter where or when it takes place, whether it is more or less complex, education has always been a political act. Paulo was adamant on this question, as were the educators of color over the last 4 decades who have followed his precepts. Moreover, Freire agreed that an activist and an educator's political orientation had to be explicit. He wrote, in the name of the respect I should have for my students, I do not see why I should omit or hide my political stance by proclaiming a neutral position that does not exist. On the contrary, my role as teacher is to assent the student's right to compare, to choose, to rupture, to decide. This has always been a significant point of contention for radical educators of color, given that within the context of education, whether conscious or not, teachers perpetuate dominant values, beliefs, myths, and meanings, although the authority they exert in the classroom. The rub here for me is that these dominant views are normalized and naturalized in such a way that they're enacted often, they're oblivious of their colonizing impact. They've just become so commonsensical in the Gramscian sense that people are totally unaware that they're holding deficit notions in the way that they're talking about students. And sometimes they think that because they do it in a nice, kind of sweet way, that somehow that's going to, be less colonizing and less, the impact is going to be less negative. the truth of the matter is, it doesn't matter. At the fundamental piece is, how does the way you think about the students and about the communities and their capacity impact then how you treat the students? Hence, what has become painfully clear to us is that education can serve either a colonizing or a decolonizing function. It all depends on the underlying ideological assumptions of power and the purpose of the pedagogy we enact, whether wittingly or unwittingly. Unfortunately, more often than not, the hidden curriculum of schooling and the media condition students to ascribe to the dominant ideological norms and cultural assumptions of the prevailing social order. In addition, it socializes students to accept a prescribed role or location within that social order, a role or place that historically has been predicated by the political economy and its colonizing institutional structures. Schools then are both enmeshed in the political economy of a society and at its service. Moreover, Freire rightly asserts that the more we deny the political dimensions of education, the more we assume the moral potential to blame the victim and to perpetuate deficit myths about those who are deemed the other. And by so doing, collude with educational policies and practices that result in wholesale inequalities and social exclusions. For this reason, our pedagogy with students from culturally marginalized communities must be shaped by a critical decolonizing epistemology, one that discards the unethical acceptance of the racializing social order, that openly challenges its structures of capitalist exploitation and upholds the empowerment of disenfranchised populations as an ethical and moral imperative. Instead of educating students of color to become assimilated objects, reliable workers, complacent and obedient citizens, good managers of institutions, and out-of-control consumers, radical educators committed to decolonizing education must work to cultivate in our students a critical understanding of their histories and everyday lives while integrating with respect, dignity, the wisdom of their lived cultural knowledge. To accomplish this requires that educators understand how, as a consequence of cultural, linguistic, and economic subjugation, racialized populations everywhere must still contend with the consequences of a history of violence and dispossession. I think I see that most when there is an attitude, because of the individualism that exists in the ways in which our behaviors are interpreted. There's a tendency to not understand that if your people were enslaved, for 200 years, if people were colonized, for centuries, that somehow the impact of that remains in us, and part of our struggle continues to be, how do we lift those away? How do we push that out of our own psyche, out of our own predispositions, and find another way of being, of transforming ourselves within, both as individuals and collectively. And I feel that at times that's very, very difficult in a worldview that believes that if you're an enlightened human being, that somehow you can be under the worst conditions and somehow just be fine. Not suffer anxiety, not suffer anger, that somehow that's how it proves that you somehow are truly a gifted and talented and enlightened being. You can tell I have problems with a lot of the new agey junk. Hence to divorce, I wanted to say something else, but I held myself. Hence to divorce our children from their cultural knowledge and histories of survival is to set them up to either fail miserably or live imitations of life. Furthermore, an unwillingness to discard the belief in the superiority of Western culture and the mantras of modernity attached to a class, racialized, and gendered code of conduct and assumptions has been one of the toughest and most pervasive issues that activists and educators of color, particularly women of color, have confronted in trying to create alliances across dominant, subordinate cultural divides. But what is clear for those of us who have remained in this relentless struggle is this. If there is to be a genuinely decolonizing approach to education, it demands the critical involvement and full participation of educators, parents, youth, and other members from those historically marginalized communities. And whatever it takes to accomplish this participation has to be part of the political project. Unfortunately, the unmerciful arrogance often enacted by white educators and colleagues who decide that they have more competence to tell our stories or to educate our children has been a major point of contention for many Black, Latino, and Native American educators over the years. It's like someone here in this context believing that because you've read some books about Maori, because you know a few Maori expressions, because maybe you have a Maori friend or two, and perhaps maybe you hung out for a few months in Maori lands, your communities, that now you're equipped to define and articulate the needs and realities of Maori communities without even the Maori being involved themselves. I mean, if you put it that way, doesn't it sound a little bit ridiculous? But that, in fact, is what goes on over and over and over again in different ways around the world. In this sort of border crosser that frequently becomes tremendously problematic to the larger decolonizing project in education. Does this mean that, that whites cannot be part of the struggle? Because, of course, that's what often people hear. Of course not. Of course, they can and must be. But they must enter very carefully, aware of their privilege and their internalized hegemonic assumptions about the abilities and capacities of those who are othered, which may betray their well-meaning intentions. The only remedy here is a willingness to remain in ongoing dialogue as full peers and comrades, offering their privilege, knowledge, and resources in the service of the largest struggle for emancipation. This is akin to what Paulo Freire often called committing class suicide. Some people don't like that term. I think it kind of speaks well. Although there are educational, I want to turn as I kind of end my talk. You're probably wondering, when is she going to bring this down? I want to just turn for a minute to Tucson, Arizona. Although there are educational and political theorists who seek to discredit Paulo Freire's work or make it irrelevant to the struggles of today, Freire just did not provide enough of a systematic analysis. I want to argue that for working class communities of color who continue to wage decolonizing struggles for educational justice, Freire's writings persist as an important intellectual force, inspiring literacy programs, popular education programs, youth programs, labor education initiatives, and independent schools in poor and working class communities of color. Black New Yorkers for Educational Excellence, the Institute for Cultural and Linguistic Democracy, La Escuelita, El Centro de la Raza, Alviso Campos High School, and the Raza Studies program in Tucson were all founded on Freire's pedagogical principles. I'm going to take just a moment to speak about the Raza program in Tucson, which was shut down in January of 2012. The program was eliminated after a prolonged, brutal campaign to demonize the students, the teachers, and their community. One of the rights gained in this hard-fought struggle of the 60s and 70s was the inclusion of ethnic studies into the educational curriculum, a right that is quickly eroding in the current climate of neoliberal multiculturalism. At best, ethnic studies courses offered for African American, Puerto Rican, Chicano, Native American, and Asian American students an opportunity to learn their histories and to forge political consciousness with respect to the largest struggle for democratic life. In the sanctuary of these classrooms, different cultural histories could find a place to be engaged as part of the process of knowledge production, given that these different histories embody different ways of knowing, different ways of understanding the world. Similarly, a pedagogical process of decolonization with social justice as a major objective sat at the heart of the curriculum, as it was in the Raza Studies program in Arizona. For over a decade, the high school program achieved unprecedented success with working class students, most of whom were Chicano, Mexicano, or Native American students. This was a student population who had been subjected to almost 2 centuries of marginalization and dispossession in the Southwest. And when I talk about unprecedented success, I mean, if you just measure, if you just want to go to the traditional measure, 93% of these kids were graduating. And this was a group of kids where you had 40 to 50% dropout rates and higher during certain years. Beyond the typical markers of success, educational achievement and individual aspiration, these high school students demonstrated through their actions that they had undergone an effective process of cultural and political formation, one that has assisted them to begin disrupting the cultural invasion of generations. The program resulted in a large number of the students electing over the years to participate collectively in school and public community forums to speak out on issues related to their educational community needs. They formed political study circles and strategized ways in which they might work together toward self-determination in their communities. In the program, students read textbooks that spoke of their own histories and the conditions that shaped their lives. They learned about technology in ways that nurtured their critical understanding of media literacy, and they became media producers of videos and CDs that spoke of their everyday lives and educational struggles. Learning was inherently a community process where relationships were central to the pedagogy. Students who had never before felt engaged in their education were now actively present and involved in dialogical processes of learning that were meaningful and that culturally resonated with their histories and everyday life. In the process of their intellectual formation, one of the books that was required reading was Pedagogy of the Oppressed, along with six other books. Pedagogy of the Oppressed was banned earlier this year by public school officials. Teachers were told to stay away from any book that made, quote unquote, race, ethnicity, and oppression central themes. Today, the Raza Studies program remains at the center of this controversy and this struggle, as the state of Arizona passed measures to not only ban the program, but also to thwart undocumented immigrant mobility in the state and reinforce English-only practices in the classroom. State educational officials have gone after teachers in the Raza Studies program, accusing them of separatism, reverse racism, inclusion of subversive texts in the classroom, discrimination, and anti-American views, and brainwashing of students. Despite the inflammatory and reactionary tone of the accusations made against them in newspapers and court proceedings, Tucson educators and activists have continued to fight back in an effort to provide a humanizing educational experience for their students, an educational experience that also places the text about students' histories, cultural values, and traditions at the center of the pedagogical process, so that these can then be compared and contested with respect to the reading of the traditional texts that are required. In place of that authoritarian, competitive, and individualistic culture of mainstream education, the decolonizing pedagogy of Raza Studies program focus on the co-creation of knowledge and the communal learning of students. One of their sayings, en Lakesh, tú eres mi otro yo. You are my other I, en Lakesh, serves as an example of one of the decolonizing principles of their classrooms. In Lakesh, you are my other I. This powerful principle of In Lakesh, derived from indigenous readings of the world, pedagogically resonates with students' deep communal and interdependent relationships with one another, to the land, and to all human beings and all living beings. And it is precisely the power of the collective political grace that such a decolonizing educational process has awakened and generated in students that has caused the fear-based responses of modern-day white settlers of Arizona, many who came to this from big cities to stake their retirement claims on land that was systematically robbed from indigenous populations. For these activists and educators of color, Paulo Freire's pedagogical promise for the transformation of education remains a revolutionary inspiration today, just as it was to those who embraced pedagogy of the oppressed in the early days. Yes, there are many texts today that offer new generations of readings and interpretations of the experiences of racialized population in the U.S. and abroad. Yet it is Freire's powerful and resounding message of radical hope and a language of possibility that ignited the minds and hearts of educators, students, and community members involved in this struggle in Tucson. Despite the overwhelming nature of the political project that informed his dreams, Paulo Freire remains an emissary of hope for the oppressed. Freire's notion of radical hope is anchored in a lifelong revolutionary commitment to counter all forms of poverty, to contest the arbitrary power of the ruling class, to unveil the dehumanizing forces of violence within schools and communities, and to confront and undo the destructive consequences of capitalist dominion on the earth. In The Politics of Education, Freire spoke of a revolutionary vision. A revolutionary vision, he said, tends to be dynamic rather than static, tends towards life rather than death, toward the future as a challenge to our creativity rather than a repetition of the present, towards love as liberation of subjects rather than as possessiveness, toward the emotion of life rather than cold abstractions, toward men and women who organize themselves reflectively for actions rather than order, to creative and communicative language rather than prescriptive signals, to reflective challenges rather than domesticating slogans, and to values that are lived rather than myths that are imposed. Whether the educators and students in Tucson are able to save the program is not really the central point, although the hope is that they will. But rather that through this decolonizing pedagogical process, the teachers, the students, the parents, and the community accepted the challenge to creativity and are refusing to repeat the past. Similarly, decolonizing struggles against Eurocentric oppression persist everywhere today, but can only persist when we work in solidarity to take ownership of our communities and struggle to radically change the political and economic structures of power that defile our humanity and our revolutionary dreams. Whether in Palestine, the streets of London, or Greece, the Dene Reservation of New Mexico, the Zapatistas in Chiapas, the teachers in Oaxaca, the Ugandan struggle in Ethiopia, the indigenous movement in Colombia, within Aboriginal and Maori communities here in Australia and New Zealand, or the small but mighty community fighting for Rasa studies in Tucson. There are oppressed communities everywhere who persist in the fight for justice and who embrace the man from Recife as one of the brightest guiding lights of our continuing struggle to decolonize education and the world today. Let me conclude with the words of my esteemed colleague, Donaldo Macedo, who collaborated with Freire for more than 16 years and was his translator for many of his texts. Donaldo wrote, Freire's words of wisdom, his penetrating and insightful ideas, his courage to denounce in order to announce, his courage to love without fear of being ascientific or anti-scientific, his humility and his humanity make him immortal, a forever present force that keeps alive our understanding of history as possibility. We are all truly indebted to Paulo Freire for teaching us about our right to read the world and for challenging us to become full subjects of our destinies through decolonizing our minds, our hearts, our bodies, and our spirits. And to that, in the traditional way of Latin America, I say, Paulo Freire, presente.